Thank you so much. I still always find myself distracted when I hear those Bach suites. It's one of two pieces that I've played in public only. I did not play it for Janos Strucker. And I happen to know that Janos wasn't terribly happy with that. He viewed it as a younger rendition. But it's a fun thing to talk about. I could talk about just that. But it's good to see you. If there's ever a time when we need connection, I think we're there. And on that note, they tell you to start with an opening joke, but one of the things I love about being a UU is that our God believes in us so much that he lets us take the summers off. And the other line is, we all know a loving God would not consign Unitarians to hell because he's too virtual to do so. But God wouldn't consign Universalists to hell because they are too virtuous for her to do so. And if you know why that's funny, you're an in-the-cradle Unitarian. Now, while Unitarians are not an exclusively progressively institution, if we studied, the history of the American mind, half the people who know where Unitarians fit there, they think of Emerson, Thoreau, Melville, Hawthorne, Rod Serling, Sylvia Plath. We can do several talks on that alone. And some folks even refer to Franklin and Jefferson as de facto Unitarians. I don't know if they would have embraced the title. But they differed from other founding fathers whose religious identities, so many churches, man, they throw hard elbows trying to claim that founding fathers were of this faith or of this faith. And he was there, he understood. And what that kind of view of history allows us to easily forget that the founding fathers introduced religious tolerance at that particular time in history. A lot of it was to keep Baptists from being slaughtered in the South. Baptists attracted attention with practices that a lot of folks thought were a little bit kooky. And most Christian evangelicals think they're being persecuted now. Oh, lovely. It was horrible. And some of our current cultural issues revolve around the fact that, our best Enlightenment thinking sought to protect the rights of Baptists to be just a little bit kooky. And those principles now, the tolerance, are being threatened by the evangelical movement. That's kind of an irony impairment, I find. Now, though, I think it's fair to say that we've chosen to dismantle some institutions that were dedicated to some of the most generous thoughts of the Enlightenment era. I mean, we're seeing it on the news every day. I'm not sure most people who voted for the current regime would endorse that reading. We Unitarians will, however, because we've been paying attention and we enjoy our identity as a liberal faith, and that requires irony to exist. If you're a Unitarian without irony, you feel very alone in this congregation. And among that is the knowledge that American Buddhist Unitarians are definitely a thing. There's a lot of us. We know we're welcome here. And many of the principles upon which UU attempts to grow could be a list of how to run a monastery. It's about good management, frankly. And if you just follow the 7 principles, even as a Buddhist, you're not likely to run afoul of Unitarians, and you're going to have an awful lot of spiritual growth. But I want to invoke a Buddhist idea more directly that can't replace our 4th principle, and I'll define it shortly, but can augment it almost instantly. I want to make the case that we are leaving some really good ideas on the table until we focus on right effort from the Noble Eightfold Path. Noble Eightfold Path. I want to start with a paragraph from the Washington Post's Carlos Lozada. He won the Pulitzer Prize in 2019 for criticism, and nearly won it in 2018. He wrote a book entitled What Were We Thinking? A Brief Intellectual History of the Trump Era. And this is from a capsule introduction he wrote for the Post. But the impassioned calls for unity found in resistance books have aimed primarily at those already inclined to agree. The only resistance they deem acceptable is one that embraces a fully progressive worldview. There's little room for political moderates, let alone traditional conservatives, who may also find Trump reprehensible. Much of the resistance writing stresses who can rightfully claim the label of being in the resistance, who counts and who doesn't. It encourages community but breeds exclusion. There's a difference, it turns out, between resisting and resistance. And newsflash, that was written in 2020. Now, despite this, we still almost kept the liberal consensus going. The core argument of the 1960s was between those whose idea of government was ossified and what appeared to attract mindless followers, who nevertheless held power over everybody just like them and kept people from basically learning irony and learning context and learning what you had to adjust to. You had to be this, this, and this to get in our tree fort. Otherwise, we'd pull up the ladder. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that context matters. And I'm not the person to have noticed this first. I've learned this from other cultural critics. But I've heard also from brilliant, sensitive, generous people that it doesn't matter if you didn't mean it the way I'm hearing it. You must be excised. We dismissed half a generation of good ideas out of the fear they came from monsters. The problem is monsters can mean whatever you decide it means. And we all know he who fights monsters winds up becoming a monster. Now, I didn't make up these truisms. They're out there because we have confused a responsible search for meaning with people doing what they can with what they have. And this assault on Enlightenment values didn't happen overnight or grow in secret. It grew recently because a plain-dealing public announced they were tired of this attitude and would run opponents at every level to oppose it. They invested deeply in cultural wars with us, especially after they discovered that people lie to pollsters, mostly out of social desirability. Especially in the first election, a lot of people would just say, I'm not a Trump person, until they got into the booth. Which is why so many people in 2016 said, how the heck did this happen? Well, if you ask the wrong questions, you get the wrong answers. We pretended not to believe polls while they still remained our lifeblood. I love the current, like Midas Touch and a few other folks that are out there in the progressive media landscape who always say, no, the polls don't matter to us. And they spend a lot of time on things that don't matter. But then we started using shame against the people we disagreed with politically. And we started believing that the people who, this is hard to say to my community, thank you for your patience. And half the time we started calling them idiots. We said they were uninformed, well-meaning but incapable of grown-ass government because they were kept ignorant of how the world works by a mindset that just used them as an economic engine. This is the most generous interpretation of how we've treated those people. These people. On the other side of the spectrum is the belief that they were simply too stupid to know what's good for democracy. I've heard it said. Now, the fourth principle of UU movement states we conduct a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And this is a laudable goal. It's one I've always tried to follow. And when, I think it was the early 70s when they finally started putting this out and distributing, and I cling to that because I was a Unitarian in Alaska when that came out. And it took a while back then for the ideas from Boston to get all the way into the congregations far flung, including Anchorage. I mean, this was back when you had to watch Monday Night Football the next week on film. So, I would like to think that the congregation that was so important to me as a child would probably have politely ignored all the wording. Because a free truth for meaning is by its nature responsible. The only way it can't be is if it's the search of meaning, I don't know, that is perverted to support Hitler. Hitler's easy to invoke and has few public defenders, not as few as he used to. But an unnamed tyrant doesn't seem like it has enough oomph to go viral. But Staten and Pol Pot remind us what happens when men of the cloth get corrupted by their own power. the result is a number of potential allies, a number of people we could have worked with, we should have worked with, by announcing they weren't responsible, we kept from hearing them. A lot of us are trying to navigate the question now of what do we do now? Do we join the public protests that are going on? I remember George H.W. Bush when he was responding to the campus protests that broke out during the first days of the first Gulf War. And he said during the State of the Union, there were protests going on, most of them responsible, which really annoyed the heck out of me. Because at that time, what he meant was, we can safely ignore them. You know, well, of course they're responsible. We're not, you know, you're saying this is what you can do. The protests even got sections of campus to protest in. This was like, here, go protest over here. We'll make sure, and they provided them, make sure they were safe from the elements. This was at Indiana University, so elements were there. They were not only permitted, they were encouraged, which is fine. And they had their own real estate on campus. And what happened before the first Gulf War was even over, and it was over very quickly, we didn't know what they were protesting anymore because they stayed. And after a few weeks, people stopped caring. They were just, if their goal was to stop or impede the Gulf War, I think we can agree they were ineffective. If their goal was to make themselves feel really good about being in opposition to it, it was more effective. Again, irony impairment runs deep in this culture. Because nothing in the canon of Buddhism would suggest that right effort means blowing things up. There are other restrictions on our impulse that can keep us in some balance. But between the power of shaming on social networks and the general view, at least in humor and media, that holding the 1960s white father responsible for a lot of evil in our culture gets a good laugh. And as a result, though, over time, it's not remembered as accurately as it should be. There are, Eisenhower men are not gone, but they're very quiet. And by the way, Eisenhower himself was a big believer in civil religion, in the role that religion plays in a society. But he resisted, like a lot of people who were popular with evangelicals, he resisted being pinned down to any religion and claimed no religion. He was raised Presbyterian, but I'd like to think, in fact, I know he was okay with Unitarians because he was told to be by Unitarians. But you take that and compare that to what does right effort mean? It's one of the steps on the Noble Eightfold Path. And I hate to break it to you, it means right effort. The Eastern tradition of scholarship is much more taking religious texts and different scholars would just write what they think it means on the side of the manuscript. And that in current things, if you read The Art of War, it's not just Sun Tzu, it's Sun Tzu and people commenting on it, adding little details to it. It grows the entire document instead of thinking that the document itself must somehow be above reproach or adjustment. But that ossifies it. And it's up for you to decide what right effort means. And while most of us couldn't define it better, at least philosophically or behaviorally, we're hyper-vigilant to efforts we feel threatened by. And I hope I now am the age that when I see these protests, like I've been seeing on the news lately, that I expect the protests to differ from different age groups, from different cultural groups, from different demographics. If you're protesting in Minnesota this last week, you are committed. You are all in. So don't ignore the folks. And when you see the other people who are on the other side of the political spectrum, as most of us, you know what? If they're out in the cold too, listen to them. You know, just do them the human respect of that. But when I start about dividing the different types of protests for different reasons, young people will protest for one reason. People who have families to support will protest for others. People who are more philosophical will protest differently. These subgroups in literary scholarship would be called generic. They're generic to their demographics. They belong to a genre. That's what generic used to mean, by the way. It belongs to a genre, not it doesn't have a label. Things get twisted. It's just like, incidentally, like original used to mean faithful to its origins. which meant not just made out of whole cloth with no predecessor. That's what it means now. That's not really original, it's derivative. Derivative means original. But we've departed from that a little bit. But when you think of genres, I'm going to invoke something that's regularly invoked in UU churches. The movie Caddyshack was one that has overcome generic expectations to be a cultural touchstone. It's not just a stoner movie. And on that note, the guy who watches Caddyshack to get better at golf is in the wrong place. And now this is a first for me. That, however, still overcame generic expectations. It's part of the canon. If you're in literary theory, if you're in film study, even historians refer to this thing. And that's in opposition to a movie I'm embarrassed to tell you I loved. From the early 1980s. It's called Hot Dog. And it was a silliest darn movie about basically aerial skiing was just becoming a thing, people doing aerials. So they got a bunch of people who were good at it and brought in David McNaughton, whose career was going just through the roof because he was a triple threat on Broadway, did serious work, could sing, could dance, could act. I mean, he was bringing it all. He used, but he didn't do much Alvin Ailey in the movie Hot Dog. And it was such a commercial failure, he never recovered. It did not exceed the expectations of a stoner movie. It stayed right there. But, not all movies bust out of their genre to influence the rest of the population. In films, it's not because it wasn't an intergenerational drama like The Godfather or so forth. And we all know The Godfather 3 was the best of all of them. Irony impairment is deep in our culture. But that doesn't mean that these smaller efforts should be ignored, but just don't take them too seriously. David McNaughton does not want you taking it seriously. You don't stop Caddyshack to criticize the swings, and as we do on some efforts. Larger efforts matter. And what the Buddha seems to have intimated is that you can learn from even a broken spirit how to commit to right effort. He welcomed all who were willing to undergo the training to be released from the suffering of everything, being the same and not changing, which the Buddhists call samsara. If you stop imagining it as reincarnation, you'd be surprised how it motivates right effort. The Buddha took in the mass murderer Angulimala, who became the patron saint of pregnancy in the Thailand and Burmese parts of the world. He's still prayed to in 2025. I tell this story during my sanghas here every 2 weeks, Saturday, right here. But those who run sanghas, that's just a word Buddhists use instead of congregation, have a lineage of training specifically to help bring in those who have fallen short of their own moral ideas or haven't had the economic or cultural freedom to develop with the requisite purity to qualify for being a real progressive. Men abused in childhood are crucified for repeating that pattern in their own families, while many cannot understand what they're doing, why what they're doing is considered wrong. This is especially true when abuse became emotional, verbal. So many men just stopped, or let me see, I'll get there. Women who keep trusting the wrong guy because the desire for purity is easily fooled by impure methods, and even the dimmest man knows when his entire identity is rejected, if he can't do anything right, he doesn't stop trying, he stops telling you about it. And these men go forth and are quiet among their fellow men, and then fellow men feel less empowered to express their own opinions. The opinions unexpressed are largely harmless and drift away, leaving a man in his 50s who can't remember anything because all he sees as himself is being shamed for not being perfect. When someone reaches into his bubble and seems to understand him in this vulnerable state, he often leaps with alacrity into that community, no matter how far from his personal morality it may stray. And yes, some of those dreams deferred will in fact explode. Langston told us this a long time ago. And as usual, his biggest fans ignored that anyone can have this experience. Too many people read it and say that experience belongs to others. It overcame the genre of lyric poetry by appealing to that universal. And I ask my fellow Unitarians, especially those who feel frustrated and want to know what to do right now, to join the resistance. And I only say this, don't None of us can pass their purity laws. Be the resistance yourself. Tell the truth a little bit faster without worrying how others will react. Don't insist on being diplomatic on those occasions where being direct is possible. And if it's not yet possible, study past Unitarians even. Read The American Scholar and realize that one of the key essays that described and formed practically what is now known the American spirit. This is what you tell people who say, I don't care for Emerson because his views on the liberation of the blacks in the South weren't quite up to speed right now. And I've heard this, strangely enough. But before we get too high and mighty about that, remember that the Unitarian Church wasn't down with him either and kicked him out of Harvard for 32 years for giving that talk. 32 years. He couldn't influence the folks directly. And direct is different. That's why Phil's laughing. This very essay, like I said, got him kicked out of Harvard, our Unitarian crown jewel of an institution, but departing from the church's then current principles. Emerson wasn't pure enough to be Unitarian. And given his status in English department, where he's still not invited to the party because of those the opinions on the other side of the spectrum, Unitarians have a tradition like anyone else of kicking out their heretics, just like most American churches. It's time to stop idealizing our community and see it clearly for what it is. If you're a hardworking person who cares for their family and every once in a while tries to do something to surmount your self-interest, then you're my brother or sister. I don't care if you chose a political system I abhor. You're trying to do better. You're trying to reduce suffering. And it has to begin with reducing your own. This is right effort. And though it's widespread enough in humans and easily reminded enough that nothing that's really proposed with right effort, even if it's oppositional to your way of thinking, tends not to be rejected. We know right effort kind of when we see it. When that's where people will say, well, you know, he's kind of a right-wing Christian, but he really walks the walk. You know, he's good with his family. He's a good person. It's as though you're having to explain why they're a good person despite of what they believe. Effort usurps what we mean as Unitarians when we say responsible in our search for meaning. I wouldn't mind the excision of that word from our principles. In fact, as it fosters division and congregational efforts that impact other Unitarian congregations and appeals to our less noble human qualities. Not ours. Absolutely, we're above all that. I ask us to remain down-to-earth, non-judgmental believers in a reality that precludes the belief that our reaction to mortality is inherently superior to anybody else's. That's not easy. Partly because, let's admit it, it feels good to see people justifying why they think their effort is responsible. And come on, don't we feel good when we see others who might seem to represent themselves as paragons of tolerance and openness, only to find, after a deep dive into their past, their internet history, their published opinions, or failing that, their alleged private behavior that reeks of hypocrisy. We're not above taking a little joy in that. Schadenfreude is a word for a reason. Don't conflate a bouncer with a ticket taker. Ticket takers keep people out who shouldn't be there. Bouncers throw people out who want to stay in. I'm not immune to this egotism. I love it when someone with an Ivy League degree in my counseling offices or in some of the Sangha work, because so much unlearning needs to be done for them to begin working to help suffering, that my ego reminds me I'm just the guy to do it. For men, I mean, I continue to listen to women who seem to be united in their opinion that I do not understand or represent them. And I have my own ego hindrance in the deep pride I take in being a trailer park kid from North Enid, Oklahoma, who can beat most Harvard grads at cultural linguistic analysis. I used to pick that fight. And my mother wants you to know we were only briefly in a trailer park. For what it's worth, I don't feel that way about Jeopardy champions. And in fact, I didn't pass the in-person audition 20 years ago. And thank God Alex Trebek personally gave me and the three other people in the room permission to say I missed it by 1 point. I'm allowed to say that. But back to our carriages, as Montaigne would say, conflating resisting and resistance has consequences. Our side, if you want to put it that way, has more bouncers than you realize. Conservatives are welcome in our congregation officially, but ask them how welcome they feel. What none of these words can do is change the fact that many friends and colleagues of mine are suffering acutely right now. So what is it to be done? We can practice just a bit more mindfulness, especially knowing that taking refuge from our frustration should be the first order of business. Our own minds continue to be the author of our spiritual suffering. And if we can't accept that in peacetime, it will devastate us in times of conflict. I'm not a statesman and have not placed myself in a position with my work to address statesmen and women. I don't know the subroutines they have to tend to in order to feel peace in the midst of work that is rarely peace-inducing, at least not immediately. I imagine those subroutines are very much like mine. Do you think they might be like yours? We can only reduce mass suffering together. I'd like us to remember that before we start broadcasting that we're morally superior to our opponents. Start by reading some of our past Unitarians with an eye towards understanding the history we've always been a little suspicious of. Ask our minister where to start. Philip's journey himself has been about overcoming hindrances in Unitarianism and his own life. He understands right effort, so effort to talk to him. Learn to be still with your thoughts, even the painful ones. Mourn, regret, be angry. Then put your big girl or big boy clothes on and go do the work on yourself first. Being direct with yourself helps you tolerate context and increases your irony quotient. That's what IQ is for me. Know that your reaction to morality is no more superior than anyone else's. It's what our famous American Unitarians have always said, because it is our ideal. But we have to stop being self-appointed bouncers to people we don't want in the club. And by the way, American Buddhists are horrible about this. Horrible. They treat beginners awfully. It's like, well, I wanted to be a Buddhist. Yeah, right. Okay, so, here's what you're doing wrong already. I found 4 unenlightened things you've done before breakfast. It's like, will you just let them be imperfect as we are? So trust me, I have a stronger talk for my Buddhists. But the good news is you did choose a great place to start in UU. My UU upbringing made me particularly open to Buddhism because it was in Alaska and the Pacific Rim, and we had an awful lot of Asian religions introduced to us in our RE. And Buddhism, along with counseling, has been the saving grace of my reality, of my life. I really hope you find those graces here. Thank you.